Welcome to our final review. In this review, I'm going to go over a few things. First and foremost is the final exam, which will be on Wednesday, May 7th at 9 o'clock. Not 8:30, not 9:30, 9 o'clock. The format of the exam will be very similar to the midterm exam. That is, you'll have 5 identification questions and 3 essay questions. You'll have a lot of flexibility in which material you can use to answer these questions, but keep in mind that the entire exam will be based on the 13 chapters that we've covered so far in the second half of the course, which I think is basically since March. Now, on to the material. The rest of this review will basically constitute reviewing the 13 chapters that you guys presented on in this class, and I'm going to give you a bit of a review on each one of these chapters. It shouldn't take very long, just a few minutes. I'm going to take just a couple of minutes, but just a few points I want to make about each one and about the way you guys presented it. For the most part, you guys did an outstanding job in explaining what each chapter was about. You also did a great job in explaining what each chapter's relevance was to each other's material that we covered. So I wanted to sort of recap on that and use that as the basis of today's review. Again, not very long, just want to give you a quick summary of each chapter that we've covered. Now, the first chapter we covered in this class was by Howard Rheingold, taken from the book Net Smarts. Howard Rheingold, in his book Net Smarts, suggests some ways for controlling our digital lives. And in fact, the entire book is kind of a how-to handbook on how to do that. The first chapter that we actually had someone present on was Lauren, presenting on Crap Detection 101, how to find what you need to know and how to decide if it's true. I have to look down to get the whole title here, guys. This chapter here sets forth some guidelines for establishing the validity, it's hard for me to say, validity of what's on the web and whether to decide whether it's actually accurate, informative, and not misleading. Now, this is one of the things that Rheingold really tries to stress, is that there is really no difference between your life on the internet and your life in person, and that you should use exactly the same tools you would use for detecting crap, shall we say, as you would in any other form. And so this really relies on you using your judgment and not to just simply go with the first search result or even what you might find to be true, because as we'll discuss later, sometimes it might not be. Jennifer presented the second chapter of this from this book, our second chapter overall, number 2, which is Social Digital Know-How, the Arts and Science of Collective Intelligence. Now, again, another long title from Rheingold here, but this chapter outlines some of the many benefits of collaborative communities on the internet. Now, I have to just tell you, Howard Rheingold, we actually saw him very early on in the semester when he appeared on that show, Computer Chronicles, talking about internet. One of the things he talks about in that episode, in fact, the only thing he really talks about in this episode, is a community called The Well. And The Well is a community, an online community that formed very early on in the 1980s, even before the internet. And in this case, what we're going to look at, he looks at, is really how people connect from all over the world on topics that are very, very dear to them, and it might be even very personal to them. But that they find that they can communicate and form communities with each other is a really kind of a positive outcome in his view, and it's one that is sort of, he says that it's continued on in the web. And Jennifer's presentation on looking at how people share images, how they share each other's work for free, really, to form these ad hoc communities, is in fact one of those very sort of examples of how these communities can form. Moving on to our next book, Program or Be Programmed by Douglas Rushkoff. This book here is similar to Rheingold's book in that Douglas Rushkoff enumerates 10 commandments for thriving online. These rules here are meant to remind us of how to control our experience online and how to remain, again, grounded in our own individual and human, personalities. The chapter that Liz presented on was Be Yourself, which is the 6th chapter, the 6th commandment that Rushkoff outlines. In this chapter, Rushkoff argues for us to maintain our identity to remain honest online. This ensures that we don't hide behind anonymity. God, it's hard to say. Anonymity. There we go. And maintain a civilized disposition online. That is to say that that we don't become trolls, and as awful as that word sounds, it really is kind of a common thing online, and that we own up to our own words and expression, and that we do so in a professional, civilized manner. In fact, that's really what he's trying to say here, is that we maintain a civilized personality, civilized disposition on the internet. In other words, the internet is not a shield, but really more of a, I don't know, to think of a good metaphor. Let's say a front. Liz summarized this particular chapter, this particular commandment, really in the context of the other commandments that we had in the rest of the book, which are also important, but you guys didn't really get to read. And I did send out another chapter or two before she presented, so you may want to review those if you want to get a sense of what those chapters are. But there will be only questions coming from this chapter for the final. But again, I recommend reviewing the rest of them if you want to kind of understand what Rushkoff's about and how this chapter fits, because it really does need the other 5 chapters before it to kind of make sense. So I hope that might help you out a little bit. The third book we looked at in this class was The Googleization of Everything and Why We Shouldn't Worry by Siva by Hayanathan. There we go. What he does in this book is he exposes some of the ways that Google has become the de facto utility for the internet. In other words, it is almost synonymous with the internet for most of us. The first chapter we examined from this book was The Googleization of Us. In it, he explains how we become dependent on all of Google's services for the purpose of creating rich profiles. In other words, we in effect are Googleized, according to Hayanathan. It is also an example of what Eli Paris, which we'll look at in a little bit, refers to as personalization. And this is a very kind of recurring theme, maybe even a subject for a test question, that comes up in this class and many of the readings that we've examined here. Now, Claudia presented on this chapter, and you'll remember that she explained her own dependence on the services that she used from Google, and how, in effect, she's Googleized and is kind of okay with it. It's okay, Claudia. The next chapter we also looked at from this book was Ways and Means, Faith and Aptitude in Technology. And what we're going to look at is how, in this chapter, what he looks at, Hayanathan looks at, is how the cultural assumptions that underline the enthusiastic reception of what Google is and what it does. This chapter was presented by Lauren. Happy birthday, Lauren. Explained how a simple search engine interface became a biased provider of information. That was really her kind of her big takeaway point, which I really thought was very elegantly presented. The chapter also looks at the values that have characterized Google's practices and its peoples, and how essentially it enables our experience online by doing all kinds of, let's face it, what's referred to as aptocracy. And this is what Hayanathan refers to later when he explains the battery of tests that the people have to take. But they're essentially a technocratic institution run for the sake of really creating the best experience online. Now, there's nothing wrong with that inherently, but what happens is, because of the way that they exercise that power, it becomes essentially a problematic situation, one that makes them all too powerful. And that's one of the things that this book is really critical of. The fourth book we looked at in this class, yes, there's a few more to go, was Networked, The New Social Operating System by Lee Rainey and Barry Wellman. In this book, the two authors, who are, again, social scientists, challenge the assumption that digital technologies are isolating us. Now, this was a very, I think, easy summary for me to do, because you just simply got it right away, what they're basically telling you. They're taking the common assumption or presumption that we are being isolated by constantly staring at our screens. I got one here, you can't see it probably. And they explain, however, that these are not tools of isolation, but maybe are something different. And what they're different is that they are tools of connection. The authors explain here, Wellman and Rainey, explain that there are 3 revolutions that have happened that have converged to create this new condition, let's say. The first one is the rise of the social networks, and that we're referring to, again, not just Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, etc. We're talking about actually you and I trying to connect with each other socially. And that's obviously a very old need and a very old activity, but still is an important one that maybe we haven't done in our entire time as a species. The second revolution is that of the internet, which is a lot newer than any of the social networks. The internet, of course, being quite new, 20 or so years old, is also an important strategy for constantly connecting us with each other in ways that were never before possible. And the third revolution that they talk about is the proliferation of mobile devices. That is, that they're always with us. And these three things create a condition which they refer to as networked individualism. Now, I'm going to tell you a little secret. I found that same phrase in other books. And one of the books I saw it in was Reingold's book, which I talked about earlier. In this presentation, in the chapter that we read from this book, which was Networked Relationships, chapter 5, if I'm not mistaken, Shira explained how digital social networks strengthen personal connections in the real world. And what we're trying to say here is like, wait, what? Really? That that this completely goes against what you and I might think initially about what digital social networks might do, but instead that we're actually using them to connect with each other. And in fact, our interactions on these networks very much parallel our own experience. It's a very, very refreshing and very, I think, advanced argument that they put forth that's very simple to understand, and I think it's something we don't get a lot of. The fifth book we've covered was The Filter Bubble by Eli Pariser. Pariser here explains and reveals through something called personalization, the internet is in effect hiding information and ideas from us for the sake of presenting us a relevant experience. And he mentions that really the year 2009 he refers to as day one, or maybe even day zero, of personalization, when Google announced that it's using not just your logged in account, but all kinds of personally identifiable signals to create an experience for you that shows you relevant search results. And some of those are very, I think, useful, since I don't care where barbers are in Albany, New York, per se, versus what kind of barbers I can find here locally in New York City, because I don't need a haircut, but you know what I mean. But the thing is that I also will not get a lot of information that might be more relevant for me because the algorithm has decided not to. Part of his argument is to expose one of the great, I would say, lies of the internet, and that is that it is an abundant medium, that it constantly presents to you more information than you can ever handle. But one of the things that also Vaidyanathan also talks about, and we talked about Googleization, is that in fact it makes the web really manageable. It makes it clean, it works, all those search results we get the best search results, and we're not, likely to contract any kind of nasty computer viruses or such. So it's really kind of nice, but at the same time it is also very sanitized. And also, as you might imagine, with that connotation of that word comes, is that you also miss out on a lot of, perhaps, diversity. One of the things that we covered 2 chapters in this book. One of them was the user as the content. Now, Hisham addressed this chapter in relationship to the news and how the news we get is actually heavily filtered through personalization. The more popular news stories in our algorithmically relevant feed circulate rather than the ones that are probably more important, probably the ones that we quote-unquote should know about. We can consider also, again, Walter Lippmann's ideas of public opinion. Now, again, we're referring here to an old media idea, to new media, but back when he was talking about radio and newspapers and their constant barrage of news was a new thing to be concerned about. And he basically established that there's some things that people might want to know, but there really are some things that people should know. And it's our job as journalists, as public opinion makers, to make sure that we give them what is right in the public interest. This is really a chilling prospect when you think of the fact that we have arguably more access to any information than we've ever had at any given point in history, and that this condition is kind of, I think, counterintuitive and counterproductive to what we want to do. The next chapter that we looked at in this book was one that Rebecca covered, the Adderall Society. It's a metaphor, obviously, for the fact that we are so focused on a specific task and a specific, let's say, project, that we lose sight of anything else that might not be related. In fact, the filter bubble, in a sense, works that way. It filters out and keeps us away from anything else we might need to cover. And that's one of the things that isolates us. It is invisible and it is inescapable, the filter bubble, that is. The filter bubble impacts our collective creativity and our potential for solving problems, our solution horizon. We can never think outside the box. We can never think outside of the bubble. The sixth book we looked at was by Evgeny Morozov, called Save Everything, Click Here. The book locates two tendencies in contemporary digital culture. One, solutionism, which is basically finding solutions to problems that don't really need fixing in the first place. And the second one, the internet centrism, as he calls it, a belief that everything can be solved using the internet. It's kind of an old, there's an old saying that a lot of people like to throw around these days, saying, when your only tool is a hammer, all of the problems are nails. And in this regard, we are basically just walking around with hammers, breaking everything we possibly can. He also connects the ideas of the filter bubble that we discussed earlier in the class. The two chapters we read from here was How to Break Politics by Fixing It, or really, I actually can never remember the title. I might think it's the other way around, How to Fix Politics by Breaking It, but well, who knows. This chapter was summarized by Isadora, who summarized the three examples of direct democracy that Morozov outlined in his chapter. Morozov regards these as potentially dangerous because they ignore the really centuries, right, of political philosophy that we figured out already. And instead, it's basically just simply creating and destroying all political processes in favor of basically an app approach to democracy. The other chapter we read in this book was called The Perils of Algorithmic Gatekeeping. In this chapter, Morozov challenges the notion that algorithms are autonomous. He also locates the danger in the inherent biases of trusting an algorithm to the personalization paradigm of most platforms. Christina presented on this chapter and basically outlined several instances of how algorithms can be hijacked, by humans, by humans. We're winning the war against computers. And by doing so, they can also create all kinds of, let's just say disingenuous results. The next book we looked at in our series of books from the class in New Media was Cognitive Surplus by Clay Shirky. Shirky celebrates the internet as it liberates us from the confines of mass media. There's two chapters we looked at from here. One, Gin, TV, and Cognitive Surplus, which is the first chapter of the book. Shirky explains in very simple terms, and I always like this chapter because it's very, very, very simple, and it's very understandable, and it's very clear. That cultural shifts in labor in production, right, manufacturing, have had powerful effects on what we do with our leisure time. In fact, that's why we started drinking heavily, because we didn't know what else to do with ourselves. In the TV age, we did the same thing. We started to basically not need as much time to do what we needed to do. So we turned on the TV and we watched billions of hours of it. Now, we're in the same situation. We're in a post-industrial economy. We have literally an information economy is what we're working in mostly. And what we're going to look at is what we need to do with our time. And one of the things we're going to do with our time is make stuff. Cognitive surplus. Cognitive, our learning, our wisdom, and we have a lot of it. We're going to produce stuff with it. The internet makes possible, he says, for us to utilize our free time, which we call cognitive surplus, to produce culture like we never have before. It's really quite a confluence of factors, the technology and our cultural condition coming together at once to create this condition he calls cognitive surplus. Our presentation was by Miguel. He explained how these two networks, Ushahidi and Pick-a-Pal, create opportunities to share information like never before. The other thing we also looked at in this chapter, this book rather, was a chapter we looked at actually this past week, was by Allison. Happy birthday too. She explained in the chapter means, right, because it's basically a means, motive, and opportunity, like a crime. In the means chapter, Shirky explains that for the first time in history, we have the digital tools to make individual and, community publishing possible. Allison explained the example of the teenage Korean girls, who really we thought of as the last demographic you would expect to alter the outcome of three things: beef imports and exports, I guess. Second thing, international diplomacy, and finally, the national government in Korea. But it happened. This is because we have the tools and inclination to contribute to our social and political lives. This is very powerful stuff, guys. And finally, our lucky 13th chapter, if I count it right, comes from Lawrence Lessig, and from the book Free Culture. In this chapter, let's look at the book first. In this book, Lawrence Lessig examines how copyright law is being used to control our culture. He argues for the revision of copyright laws in light of the recent developments afforded us through digital technologies. In other words, copying in the 1790s was basically the printing press. You needed to have a printing press to copy. It's been very different for a long time now. Copy machines, and let's face it, these things are kind of like little copy machines. The internet is a giant copy machine, as one of the, Vince Cerf, one of the developers of the internet protocol, I heard him say once in an interview. And what's interesting here is that we need to start rethinking what copyright, given the fact that it's now actually acting as a way of suppressing our culture rather than promoting our culture. The chapter that Eugene looked at was Property, chapter 10. Lessig challenges the ideas that culture is property and that the limited time aspect of copyright should be emphasized. In other words, that we look at copyright as a way of protecting property, but in fact, it should not be used as such. It should be used instead as a way to promote the spread of science and useful arts, as is outlined in the Constitution. This is how Lessig presents the argument. Eugene also did the same, and then mentions several ways in which copyright is used to really, almost to a ludicrous extent, suppress this expression of free culture. And that's what the book is about. All right, anyway, final thoughts. Wow, I'm getting tired. I hope you appreciated that this class really wasn't about what to think about. I didn't really tell you this is the right thing. I didn't outline these are the 4 ways that the internet corrupts our youth. It's not the way the class is really meant to think about. I want you to think about things. I want you to think about things instead as a way of opening your mind to how to think about the internet, how to think about digital technologies. And the first thing it is that we might have to think about it as it being the greatest thing ever. But we also don't want to think about it as the worst thing that's ever happened to us either. So we want to really kind of exercise our judgment to figure out at what point does the internet serve us well as a society, as a culture, as individuals, and when is it not? In 2014, there's lots of different ways to study new media, and my goal really was here to try to activate these critical faculties for you. Yes, I have to read this because I wanted to make sure I got it right. And I wanted to make sure that you're making connections between the various strands we've encountered in the class. You're doing the Professor Hands too. And the best way for us to learn about anything is really to discover how we take what we encounter and to frame it in our own terms. Now, I was very, very, very deliberate about not imposing my own view, although I probably am very opinionated. I definitely will agree with that. But I didn't want to impose my own view on you. I want to make sure you came to your own conclusions, and that's why I'm looking forward to reading your papers right here. And finally, I just wanted to make sure that you're not just sitting here memorizing and just repeating what you've learned from me. I hope that what you actually have done is gain some insight into that you can study really internet, digital technology, and anything else you want to encounter in your life. You can do it the same way, and to think about it critically. Take a step back before you do something in the future, because I want to make sure that you're doing it in a way that you feel is responsible and productive for everybody, not just for profit. Anyway, I want to say thanks for a good semester. I definitely had a lot of fun, even if it was at 8:30 in the morning, and sometimes 9. And the other thing is I wanted to say good luck to you in the rest of your finals. Okay, bye everyone.